Today I'll be reading from The Slaves of Solitude by Patrick Hamilton, set in a boarding house in London in the Second World War. That's all you need to know. Oh, how the lodgers yell when they hear the dinner bell, went the old parody of the hymn. But all that exuberance has gone into the distant past. They enter now not yelling, but slinking, murmuring in a desultory manner, often 3 or 4 minutes late. When Miss Roach came in, they were all in their places and no one was speaking. Mr. Prest was at his separate table and Miss Steele was at hers. The 2 new wartime guests, the 2 shy American lieutenants who had only arrived yesterday, were at their table for 2 in a corner by themselves. Mr. Thwaites and Mrs. Barrett were at the table at which she had to sit. How she had originally got put at this table, Miss Roach could not remember, but there was nothing to be done about it now. Nothing, that is, apart from asking to be put at a separate table, which in a room and atmosphere of this sort would bring about a sensation such as she was incapable of causing. Good evening, Miss Roach, said Mr. Thwaites, and she saw his moustached elderly face giving her a funny, slightly nasty look. It was a look, or so it seemed to her sensitive imagination, which seemed to be conscious of her having dodged him on the journey downstairs from the lounge, and of his having lost thereby a moment or so of good torturing time, and for this reason it was a faintly rebuking, menacing look. At the same time, this look bore traces of gratification at having got her safely now, of relief at the fact that she was back and was going to be present at dinner to be tortured. After all, she might have somehow managed to have got a meal with a friend outside. Mr. Thwaites was certainly on Miss Roach's nerves. "Good evening, Mr. Thwaites," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Barrett," and she smiled feebly at both as she sat down. This Thwaites was a big, tall man, anything between 60 and 70. He had a fresh complexion and was, for his years and for one who took practically no exercise, unusually healthy and virile. He resounded nasally and indefatigably with a steady health and virility. He was, above all, a steady man in all his ways, in his large, flat, moustached face with its slightly flattened nose as though someone in the past had punched it, in his lethargic yet watchful brown eyes, in his way of walking and his way of talking, there could be discerned the steady, self-absorbed, dreamy, almost somnambulistic quality of the lifelong trampler through the emotions of others, of what Miss Roach would call the bully. That steady look with which as a child he would have torn off a butterfly's wing, with which as a boy he would have twisted another boy's wrist, with which as a man he would have humiliated a servant or inferior, was upon him as he now looked at Miss Roach. It never entirely left him. He had money of his own, and he had lived, resounded through boarding houses and private hotels all his life. Such places, with the timid old women they contained, were hunting grounds for his temperament, wonderfully suited and stimulating to his peculiar brand of loquacity and malevolence. He was as unfamiliar with toil as he was with exercise. He had at one time had a family connection with a firm of solicitors in London, but here he had never worked seriously, save at the task of torturing clerks and typists. "I knows the law," or "I happens to know the law," were favourite expressions of his. He was particularly fond of this facetious substitution of the third in place of the first person in the verb. He had further narrowed his mind by a considerable amount of travel abroad, where he had again always made his way to the small hotels. He was noticeably clean in his person and wore high white collars and old-fashioned ties with a tie-pin. He wore suits of durable material, coats with high lapels, trousers which did not turn up at the bottom, and elastic-sided boots. He could make himself agreeable when he wished, and had frequently been known to charm old ladies in the early stages of his acquaintanceship with them, going out of his way to do small services for them. Behind their backs, however, he would speak of them to fellow guests or servants as old frumps, desiccated spinsters, and so forth. Having said good evening and looked at Miss Roach, Mr. Thwaites had nothing more to say at the moment, and no one else in the room spoke as Sheila, the Irish maid of all work, now working as a waitress and dressed as such, hurried about putting plates of soup on the table. This soup, like the rest of the food, came up on a small service lift hidden behind a screen in a corner of the room. The lift shaft communicated directly with the kitchen underneath, and conversations frequently took place through this medium between whoever was serving the guests above and whoever was serving the lift below. Inquiries, comments, and sometimes remarks of a censorious nature being hurled down from above in the hearing of the guests, and appropriate rejoinders from below feebly making their way to the surface amidst the rumbling of the lift. In the long pauses when no one was talking, the guests listened in a hypnotised way to those backstage noises and manoeuvres. Soon after Mr. Thwaites had started upon his soup, which he always sprinkled, first of all with lumps of bread, and then with pepper, with a vigour and single-mindedness which displeased Miss Roach, he opened the conversation. "Well," he said, "your friends seem to be mightily distinguishing themselves as usual." And, oh God, thought Miss Roach, not that again. Not that again. Miss Roach's friends, according to Mr. Thwaites, were the Russian people. And Mr. Thwaites did not like or approve of these people at all. Indeed, it would not be exaggerating to say that the resistance and victories of the Russian people in the last year had practically ruined this man's peace of mind, a state of affairs which was aggravated bitterly by the fact that he was unable fully to vent his mind upon the matter in public. Mr. Thwaites had since 1939 slowly learned to swallow the disgrace of Hitler, of whom he had been from the beginning and still secretly remained a hot disciple. He could now even force himself to speak disparagingly of Hitler, but to speak well of the Russians was too much for him. He could not mention them save gloweringly, defensively, almost savagely. He had also undergone the misfortune of capturing Moscow and Leningrad within 3 weeks of the outbreak of the war, and so his boarding house sagacity had been struck at, along with his personal feelings. Actually, the Russians were not in any very particular sense Miss Roach's friends. Miss Roach was too completely bewildered, stunned, and unhappy in regard to all that was happening in the world around her for this to be so. But Miss Roach sometimes brought back literary political weeklies from London, and she had been foolish enough to leave them about in the lounge, and this, in the eyes of Mr. Thwaites, was in itself a diseased and obscurely Russian thing to do. He had therefore come practically to identify Russia with Miss Roach, and in the same way as Russia gnawed at him, he gnawed at Miss Roach. Miss Roach now tried to dodge his fury, to apologise insofar as it was possible for the present state of affairs on the Eastern Front, by smiling, making a vaguely assenting and agreeable noise in the throat, and looking hard and giddily at her soup. But Mr. Thwaites was not the sort of man who would permit you to look at your soup when he was anxious to talk about Russians. "I said," he said, looking at her, "your friends seem to be mightily distinguishing themselves, as usual." Who are my friends?" murmured Miss Roach, and she was, of course, aware that the rest of the room was listening intently. Sitting at the same table with Mr. Thwaites and having him talk at you directly was very much like being called out in front of class at school. "Your Russian friends," said Mr. Thwaites, who was never afraid of coming to the point. There was a pause. "They're not my friends," said Miss Roach wrigglingly, intending to convey that although she was friendly enough to the Russians, she was not more friendly than anybody else, and could not therefore be expected to take all the blame in the Rosamond tea rooms for the Russians' recent victories. But this was too subtle for Mr. Thwaites. "What do you mean?" he said. "They're not your friends." "Well, they're not my friends any more than anybody else's." And here Mrs. Barrett came to her rescue, as she often did. "Well," said Mrs. Barrett, "you must admit they're putting up a wonderful fight, Mr. Thwaites." "Oh yes," said Mr. Thwaites, "they're putting up a fight all right." And the savage and sombre way in which he said this suggested that they were not putting up a fight as other and decent people would, or that they were only doing so because they jolly well had to, or that their motives were of a kind that he did not care to make public. "You know," said Mrs. Barrett, "I don't think you really like the Russians, Mr. Thwaites. I don't think you realise what they're doing for us." "No," said Miss Roach, taking heart, "I don't believe he does." Mr. Thwaites was momentarily taken aback by this unexpected resistance, and there was a pause in which his eyes went glassy. "Ah," he said at last, "don't I? Don't I? Well, perhaps I don't. Maybe I thinks more than I says. Maybe I has my private views." Oh God, thought Miss Roach. Now he was beginning with his ghastly I with the third person business. As if bracing herself for a blow, as she looked at the tablecloth, she waited for more. And more came. "I keeps my counsel," said Mr. Thwaites in his slow, treacly voice. "Like the wise old owl, I sits and keeps my counsel." Miss Roach, shuddering under this agonisingly Thwaitsian remark, Thwaitsian in the highest and richest tradition, knew well enough that there was more to follow. For it was a further defect of Mr. Thwaites that when he had made a remark which he thought good, which he himself subtly realised as being Thwaitsian, he was unable to resist repeating it, either in an inverted or a slightly altered form, and he did not fail to do so on this occasion. "Yes," he said, "I keeps my counsel, like the wise old bird. I happens to keep my counsel. I happens to be like the wise old bird." And in the silence that followed, broken only by the scraping of soup spoons on plates, the whole room with all its occupants seemed to have to tremble in hushed reverence before the totally unforeseen and awful bird which had materialised in its mist, its wisdom, in its unearthly reticence. Miss Roach guessed that honour was now satisfied, that this would be enough. It was not, however, enough. With Mr. Thwaites, nothing was ever enough. "I have my doots, that's all," said Mr. Thwaites. "I have my doots." He is not, thought Miss Roach, going to add, "as the Scotchman said," is he? Surely he is not going to add, "as the Scotchman said." And Mr. Thwaites said, "As the Scotchman said, yes, I have my doots, as the Scotsman said, of yore." Only Mr. Thwaites, Miss Roach realised, could, as it were, have out-thwaited Thwaites and brought "of yore" out of the bag like that. The room, which had by this time finished its soup, maintained stupefied silence, a silence permeated and oppressed, of course, by the knowledge that Mr. Thwaites, in regard to the Russians, kept his counsel like the wise old bird, and halved his doots, as the Scotchman said of yore. If he had nothing else, Mr. Thwaites did have personality in a dining room. The maid went round quietly, removing the soup plates. "Ah, weel," said Mr. Thwaites philosophically, and by some curious process of association identifying himself now with the Scotchman of yore, whom he had quoted. "Ah, weel." And again, as the maid replaced the soup plates with the plates of warm spam and mashed potato, the room seemed to have to echo reverently Mr. Thwaites' "Ah, weel," and to be bathing in the infinite Scottish acumen with which it had been uttered. "Oh well," said Mr. Thwaites a little later, briskly returning to his own race and his own language, and with a note of challenge. We'll all be equal soon, no doubt. This clearly was another stab at the Russians. The Russians, in Mr. Thwaites' embittered vision, were undoubtedly perceived as being all equal. And so if the Germans went on retreating westward, and if Miss Roach went on approving of it and doing nothing about it, before long we should, all of us, be all equal. My lady's maid, continued Mr. Thwaites, will soon be giving orders to milady, and milord will be polishing the potboy's boots. Failing to see that he had already overreached himself in anticipating very far from equal conditions, Mr. Thwaites went on. The cabby, he said resignedly, will take it unto himself to give the orders, I suppose, and the pantry boy tell us how to proceed in our ways. Still no one had anything to say, and Mr. Thwaites, now carried away both by his own vision and his own style, went on to portray a state of society such as might have recommended itself to the art of the surrealist, or appeared in the dreams of an opium smoker. The coalman, no doubt, will see fit to give commands to the king, he said, and the navvy lord it gaily over the man of wealth. The banker will bow the knee to the crossing sweeper, I expect, and the millionaire take his wages from the passing tramp. And there was yet another silence as Mr. Thwaites gazed into the distance, seeking further luxuriant images. He had, however, now exhausted himself on this head, and for half a minute one could hear only the clatter of knives and forks upon plates. The Lord forfend, said Mr. Thwaites at last. The Lord in his grace forfend. And Miss Roach had a fleeting hope in her heart that with that little prayer the discussion, or rather the monologue, might be terminated. But Mr. Thwaites, suddenly aware of the quietness which had for so long surrounded him, and sensing perhaps that it was a little too heavy to be wholly applauding, looked around him and did not hesitate to throw down the gauntlet. At least, he said, looking straight at Miss Roach, that's what you want, isn't it? Miss Roach, putting food into her mouth, now gave as clever an imitation as she was able to of one who was not being looked at all, but knew how futile such an endeavour was. I gather that's what you want, isn't it? Said Mr. Thwaites. This was the whole trouble. It was always she who had to bear the brunt, she who had to be made the whipping boy in public for his private furies and chagrins. No, she said, her voice insecure with humiliation and anger. It's not what I want, Mr. Thwaites. Oh, said Mr. Thwaites, isn't it? That's funny. I thought it was. Here, Miss Steele, who sat at a table by herself behind Miss Roach, but in view of Mr. Thwaites, took a turn at helping her out. Well, said Miss Steele, there's a lot to be said on both sides, really, isn't there, Mr. Thwaites? What? Said Mr. Thwaites, and was so surprised by this second attack from outside, but for the moment he could say nothing. And then he added, oh, yes, there is, on all sides. After all, said Miss Steele, it's the younger generation that's got to decide, isn't it? It always was that way, and it always will be, won't it? Thus, with a clever mixture of the spirit of modernity and the wisdom of history, Miss Steele brought down two birds with one stone, and Mr. Thwaites was practically knocked out. Ah, well, we shall see, was all he could manage. But Miss Roach again guessed that he had not done yet, and she was again right. All at once, she saw his eyes shoot over to the other side of the room in the direction of the two American lieutenants who had so far been too shy to speak a word even to each other. I wonder, he said, what our friends across the water think about it all. What? And he fixed them with a horrible sort of ogling and discouraging eye. This was too hideous. Miss Roach felt she would rather be attacked herself. Not content with disgracing the Rosamond tea rooms, he was now going to disgrace his country as well. I wonder, said Mr. Thwaites, having had no answer, what our democratic friends from across the Atlantic think about it all. Our redoubtable friends from across the pond. The little old pond, eh? There was yet another ghastly pause. It was the ghastliest pause yet. Always with Mr. Thwaites, the pauses got ghastlier and ghastlier. Then one of the Americans, the bigger of the two, could just be heard murmuring that he reckoned he agreed with the lady. There was a whole lot to be said both ways. What? Said Mr. Thwaites, who had not heard what was said, but the big American would not repeat himself. The whale of a problem, said Mr. Thwaites, considerately assuming what he assumed to be the idiom of those to whom he was addressing himself. What? But the American still would not speak, and at this point things were made easier by Sheila beginning to remove the empty plates of spam and mashed potatoes and replacing them with plates of steamed pudding and custard. He will certainly, in a moment, thought Miss Roach, say, boy, or well, boy, for he hardly ever failed to do this when imitating American speech or talking about Americans. But this time he did not do exactly what she had feared. Instead, he paused a long while and then came out with something which even she could not have foreseen. The almighty dollar, said Mr. Thwaites, weightily, out of the blue and in a measured tone. He said that and nothing else. It was not easy to see exactly what Mr. Thwaites intended to establish by this. Not easy, that is to say, for one who was not acquainted with the workings of his wild and circuitous mentality. To one so acquainted, however, his meaning was fairly clear. He meant Americans in general. He had been put into the presence of Americans, and it therefore seemed to him his business as master and spokesman of the boarding house to sum up and characterize America. And in this way, he summed it up and characterized it. And here it seemed that he was conscious of having found perfect expression for the perfect thought. For he said no more. And because Mr. Thwaites said no more, the atmosphere in which pins could be heard dropping returned to the room, and no one else dared to say any more. Ruminatively, dully, around the heavy thoughts set in motion by Mr. Thwaites, the heavy steamed pudding was eaten. Miss Steele was the first to rise and leave, stealing from the room with her Life of Catherine Parr under her arm. Coffee was served in the lounge upstairs. The others followed Miss Steele one by one, their chairs squeaking on the parquet oilcloth as they rose, and squeaking again as they were self-consciously replaced under the tables in the Rosamond tea room. Good night.